Page 255, continued. Minor poets of the Victorian Age. Elizabeth Barrett. Among the minor poets of the past century, Elizabeth Barrett, Mrs. Browning, occupies perhaps the highest place in popular favor. She was born in Coxhoe, Coxhoe Hall, near Durham, in 1806, but her childhood and early youth were spent in Hertfordshire, Hertfordshire, among the Malvern Hills, made famous by Peter Pierce Plowman. In 1835, the Barrett family moved in London, where Elizabeth gained a literary reputation by the publication of the Seraphim and other poems, 1838. Then, illness and the shock caused by the tragic death of her brother in 1840 placed her frail life in danger, and for 6 years she was confined to her own room. The innate strength and beauty of her spirit here showed itself strongly in her daily study, her poetry, and especially in her interest in the social problems which sooner or later occupied all the Victorian writers. Quote, "My mind to me a kingdom is," unquote, might well have been written over the door of the room where this delicate invalid worked and suffered in loneliness and in silence. Para. In 1844, Miss Barrett published her poems, P. Capital, which, through somewhat impulsive and overwrought, met with remarkable public favor. Such poems as, quote, "The Cry of the Children," unquote, which voices the protest of page 256, humanity against child labor, appealed tremendously to the readers of the age, and this young woman's fame as a poet temporarily overshadowed that of Tennyson and Browning. Indeed, as late as 1850, when Wordsworth died, she was seriously considered for the position of Poet Laureate, which was finally given to Tennyson. A reference to Browning is, quote, "Lady Geraldine's courtship," unquote, is supposed to have first led the poet to write to Miss Barrett in 1845. Soon afterwards, he visited the invalid. They fell in love almost at first sight, and the following year, against the wishes of a father who was evidently a selfish old tyrant, Browning carried her off and married her. The exquisite romance of their love is reflected in Mrs. Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, 1850. This is a noble and inspiring book of love poems, and Stedman, Stedman, regards the opening sonnet, quote, "I thought once how Theocritus had sung," unquote, as equal to any in our language. Para. For 15 years, the Brownings lived an ideally happy life at Pisa and at Casa Guidi, Guidi, Florence, sharing the same poetical ambitions. And love was the greatest thing in the world, quote. How do I love thee? ? Let me count the ways. Stop. I love thee to the depth and breadth and heights my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight. For the ends of being, B capital, an ideal grace. Stop. I love thee to the level of everyday's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. Stop. I love thee freely as men strive for right, semicolon. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise, I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood faith, semicolon. I love thee with a love I seemed to lose, with my last saints, dash. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears, of all my life, ! Dash. And, if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. Stop. Para. Mrs. Browning entered with wholehearted enthusiasm into the aspirations of Italy in its struggle against the tyranny of Austria, and her Casa Guidi Windows 1851 is a combination of poetry and politics, both, it must be confessed, a little too emotional. In 1856, she published Aurora Leigh, Aurora Leigh, a novel in verse having for its hero a young social reformer and for its heroine a young woman, poetical and enthusiastic, who strongly suggests Elizabeth Barrett herself. It emphasizes in verse precisely the same moral and social ideals which Dickens and George Eliot were proclaiming in all their novels. Her last two volumes were Poems Before Congress, 1860, and Last Poems, published after her death. She died suddenly in 1861 and was buried in Florence. Browning's famous line, quote, "O lyric love, half angel and half bird," unquote, may well apply to her frail life and aerial spirit. Para. Rossetti, Rossetti. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, 1828 to 1882, the son of an exiled Italian painter and scholar, was distinguished both as a painter and as a poet. He was a leader in the pre-Raphaelite movement and published in the first numbers of the Germ, Germ, his, quote, hand and soul, unquote, a delicate prose study, and his famous, quote, the blessed Damozel, Damozel, unquote, beginning. I read again. The germ, his, quote, hand and soul, unquote, a delicate prose study, and his famous The Blessed Damozel, beginning, quote, the blessed damozel leaned out from the gold bar of heaven. Her eyes were deeper than the depth of waters stilled at even, semicolon. She had 3 lilies in her hand, and the stars in her hair were 7, stop, unquote, para. These two early works especially, quote, the blessed damozel, unquote, with its simplicity and exquisite spiritual quality, are characteristic of the ideals of the pre-Raphaelites. Para. In 1860, after a long engagement, Rossetti married Elizabeth Siddall, Siddal, a delicate, beautiful English girl whom he has immortalized both in his pictures and in his poetry. She died 2 years later, and Rossetti never entirely recovered from the shock. At her burial, he placed in her coffin the manuscripts of all his unpublished poems, and only at the persistent demands of his friends. At her burial, he placed in her coffin the manuscripts of all his unpublished poems, and only at the persistent demands of his friends did he allow them to be exhumed, exhumed, and printed in 1870. The publication of this volume of love poems created a sensation in literary circles, as Rossetti was hailed as one of the greatest of living poets. In 1881, he published his Ballads and Sonnets, a remarkable volume containing, among other poems, quote, The Confession, unquote, modeled after Browning. Quote, The Ballad of Sister Helen, unquote, founded on a medieval superstition. Quote, The King's Tragedy, unquote, a masterpiece of dramatic narrative. And quote, The House of Life, unquote, a collection of 101 sonnets reflecting the poet's love and loss. This last collection deserves to rank with Mrs. Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese and with Shakespeare's sonnets as one of the three great cycles of love poems in our language. It has been well said that both Rossetti and Morris paint pictures as well in their poems as, quote, 257, on their canvases, and this pictorial quality of their verse is its chief characteristic. Para. Morris, Morris. William Morris, 1834-1896, is a most interesting combination of literary man and artist. In the latter capacity as architect, designer, and manufacturer of furniture, carpets, and wallpaper, and as founder of the Kelmscott, Kelmscott Press for artistic printing and bookbinding, he has laid us all under the immense debt of gratitude. From boyhood he had steeped himself in the legends and ideals of the Middle Ages, and his best literary work is wholly medieval in spirit. The Earthly Paradise, 1868-1870, is generally regarded as his masterpiece. This delightful collection of stories in verse tells of a roving band of Vikings who are wrecked on the fabled island of Atlantis and who discover there a superior race of men having the characteristics of ideal Greeks. The Vikings remain for a year telling stories of their own Northland and listening to the classic and oriental tales of their hosts. Morris's interest in Icelandic literature is further shown by his Sigurd, Sigurd, the Volsung, Volsung, an epic founded upon one of the old sagas, and by his prose romances, The House of the Wolfings, The Story of the Glittering Plain, and The Roots of the Mountains. Later in life he became deeply interested in socialism, and two other romances, The Dream of John Ball and News from Nowhere, are interesting as modern attempts at depicting an ideal society governed by the principles of More's utopia. Para. Swinburne, Swinburne, Algernon, Algernon, Algernon Charles Swinburne, 1837 to 1909, is chronologically the last of the Victorian poets. As an artist in technique, having perfect command of all Old English verse forms and a remarkable faculty for inventing new, he seems at the present time to rank among the best in our literature. Indeed, as Stedman says, quote, "Before his advent we did not realize the full scope of English verse," stop unquote. This refers to the melodious and constantly changing form rather than to the content of Swinburne's poetry. At the death of Tennyson in 1892, he was undoubtedly the greatest living poet, and only his liberal opinions, his scorn of royalty and conventions, and the prejudice aroused by the pagan spirit of his early work prevented his appointment as poet laureate. He has written a very large number of poems, dramas, and essays in literary criticism, but we are still too near to judge of the permanence of his work or of his place in literature. Those who would read and estimate his work for themselves will do well to begin with a volume of selected poems, especially those which show his love of the sea and his exquisite appreciation of child life. His Atlanta in Calydon, Caldon, 1864, a beautiful lyric drama modeled on the Greek tragedy, is generally regarded as his masterpiece. In all his work, Swinburne carries Tennyson's love of melody to an extreme and often sacrifices sense to sound. His poetry is always musical and, like music, appeals almost exclusively to the emotions. Para. We have chosen somewhat arbitrarily these four writers, Mrs. Browning, D.G. Rossetti, Morris, and Swinburne, as representative of the minor poets of the age. But there are many others who are worthy of study. Arthur Hugh Clough, Clough, and Matthew Arnold, who are often called the poets of skepticism, Skepticism, but who in reality represent a reverent seeking for truth through reason and human experience. Frederick William Faber, Faber, the Catholic mystic, author of some exquisite hymns, and the scholarly John Cable, Keble, author of the Christian Year, our best known book of devotional verse. And among the women poets, Adelaide Procter, Adelaide, Procter, Procter, Jean, Jean Ingelow, 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 and Christina Rossetti, each of whom had a large admiring circle of readers. It would be a hopeless task at the present time to inquire into the relative merits of all these minor poets. We note only their careful workmanship and exquisite melody, their wide range of thought and feeling, their eager search for truth, each in his own way, and especially the note of freshness and vitality which they have given to English poetry. Para. The pre-Raphaelite movement, which was initiated by Dante Gabriel Rossetti in the mid-19th century, was originally not a literary but an artistic movement. Rossetti, himself a painter and a poet as well, felt that contemporary painting had become too formal, academic, and unrealistic. He desired to see it taken back to the realism, sensuousness, and devotion to detail which characterized the art of the Italian painters before Raphael. Raphael, 1483 to 1520, 20, was no doubt an excellent and noted painter of his day, but Rossetti and his ilk perhaps rightly thought that he had started the movement towards academism in art. Led by Rossetti, some painters organized themselves in London in 1848 into a group which came to be called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood . Apart from Rossetti, William Holman, Holman, page 258, Hunt, John Millais, Millis, Thomas Woolner, Wwlner, and James Collinson were the important members of this group. In painting, they broke the shackles of stereotyped traditions. Like Rousseau, Rousseau, they effected, a return to nature, by giving up the bulk of traditionalized sophistication which had accumulated over the centuries after Raphael. The creed of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was, an entire adherence to the simplicity of art, Ruskin, who came to champion the cause of the Pre-Raphaelites in the teeth of severe opposition, said that, they imitate no pictures, they paint from nature only, And again, every Pre-Raphaelite landscape background is painted to the last touch in the open air from the thing itself, Every minute accessory is painted in the same manner, And when he said this, he said a great deal. The anti-conventionalism of the Pre-Raphaelite marks them as neo-romantics.